I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Among the numerous issues I have raised in this House over the past 3 and a bit years, there is one which stands out for its magnitude and spread across my constituency, as well as the number of times I have raised it, the impact of major infrastructure projects on rural areas like mine in Buckinghamshire. Of course, before I come to my substantive comments, there is nothing that takes away my firmly held belief that the government does need to see sense and end the colossal waste of money, the unwanted project that is ruinous on the taxpayer and destructive on communities that is High Speed 2. Yeah. But I wish to focus my comments particularly on the impact that these big infrastructure projects have on the people who have to live around their construction. These projects are simply not designed with those impacted in mind. No community support scheme can possibly account for the upending of rural life that they bring, both for residents and businesses alike, and for their local elected representatives. Nothing can prepare these communities for the misery they face on a daily basis. A substantial element of that misery comes from the appalling state that these projects have left the rural road network in, which I'm grateful to my honourable friend the Minister for coming to see for himself the other week. These roads are a lifeline for most of my constituents to reach work, school, go to a hospital appointment. Yet in places they remain completely impassable and present a clear risk to all road users. It is no coincidence that the worst of these roads are concentrated around the construction compounds, being pounded every day by heavy goods vehicles in volumes and with loads that they were not built to handle. And yet the meagre funds that these projects, after much wrangling by myself, my honourable friend and neighbour, member for Aylesbury and Buckinghamshire Council, have been willing to contribute towards their repair. They don't even scratch the surface. I'm grateful that East West Rail recently conceded to fund the resurfacing of a number of roads in North Buckinghamshire, but there is a huge way to go yet. This is far, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from being a good neighbour. Being a good neighbour means clearing up after yourself, and it is clear the damage we're seeing could only have come from the constant churn of HGVs in and out of those compounds which have swallowed up huge amounts of agricultural land. This has deprived countless farmers of their livelihoods, and to make matters worse, the project's contractors and management have treated them with contempt. From flooded fields to unpaid bills, to unannounced visits and unbelievably long waits for answers to really basic questions like, when will you come to clear up the litter that your contractors have strewn across my driveway? Indeed, the approach taken by these projects to land acquisition has been poor at best, inadequate at worst. In any case, the land taken from hard-working farmers is land unlikely to be returned to its previous productive state. No one at the project can say when or how much of the land taken from farmers under supposedly temporary possession, we all remember income tax was meant to be temporary, possession, will be given back. To any farmer, this signals the end of the road. How can anyone possibly run a business having lost their main asset without knowing when it will be returned? With every delay that the project incurs, another farm risks going under. Over time, this has a devastating effect on the local rural economy, which is underpinned by farming through employment and the customs they bring. Take the Gosses in Quainton, who've been kept waiting for months for answers on whether their land will in fact be split in two. Or Deanne Wood in Twyford and Andy Hunter in Fleet Marston, both of whom have suffered terrible flooding as a result of HS2's poor monitoring. Robert Withy, whose father sadly passed away under the enormous stress and anxiety caused by the project taking over the family farm. Joseph Hodges, whose land lies not just in the railway's path, but also where the enormous infrastructure maintenance depot will be built in the coming years, a facility which has no place in such a rural location, taking vast swathes of agricultural land away from those who depend on it. And regardless of what sort of affected business we're talking about, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the project has no means to compensate them. What were the proponents of this scheme thinking? It's well established that major infrastructure projects rarely run to time or budget. HS2 takes that to a whole new level, but yet has no means to compensate those who've materially suffered under its weight. Let me give you the example, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of the Prince of Wales pub in Steeple Claydon, a village which is surrounded by compounds on all sides. With so much construction concentrated in one small area, the seemingly endless road closures that each project supposedly requires has a knock-on effect for businesses that rely on customers travelling between villages, as well as for the hard-working employees of those businesses. So when East West Rail shut Queen Catherine Road and HS2 shut Addison Road last year, the Prince of Wales lost approximately £3,000 in turnover a week, which is massive for any small village pub. This is on top of the 50, 60, 70% increases in gas and electricity bills we've seen recently. It's further estimated that the upcoming closure of Addison Road from February to the end of July this year will cost that pub another £50,000 in lost revenue. But no compensation is on the table. The risk of these businesses being caught in a perpetual cycle of endless road closures therefore goes far beyond the business itself. It deprives residents of long-standing community assets without any recompense, or even so much as an acknowledgement of how devastating such losses are. Take Andy and Dan Price's coach company, Langston and Tasker, whose business by nature relies on the local road network to operate. A contracted provider of school transport for Buckinghamshire Council, they have also been caught in the road closure shuffle, and any roads they can use risk covering their vehicles in mud or even, and actually often, ripping tyres off their rims. And yet they too have never been compensated. No compensation for any of the damage which is undoubtedly caused by both HS2 and East West Rail's construction vehicles. All the while, school children continually turn up late, having been kept waiting at the bus stop while HS2 and East West Rail's HGVs come speeding past, putting at risk anyone unlucky enough to come face to face with a driver who's more interested in putting his own schedule above the safety of other road users. For Langston and Tasker, Andy and Dan are having to deal with huge diversions, all of which put significant strain on company finances through added fuel cost and wear and tear. Buckingham Road closed, an additional 92 miles a day, that's 460 miles a week. West Street closed, an additional 110 miles per day, 550 miles per week for them. Queen Catherine Road closed, an additional 20 miles a day, another 100 miles a week on the bottom line for that bus company. West Street and Queen Catherine Road closed, an additional 182 miles per day, 910 miles extra per week for that company. That costs fuel, that costs tyres, that costs them their business. And behind the scenes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the project's directors have clearly lost control of their contractors, with one going so far as to seek planning permission for a training centre, now downgraded to a storage facility near Twyford, which I'm extremely disappointed to report to the House has been granted planning permission by the Planning Inspectorate. How on earth can a contractor be allowed to seek permission for something not in the Act and so substantial and so unsuitable for a rural environment, so close to residents and on top of all the existing disruption that HS2 has already brought on this community? This sets a worrying precedent for all rural communities that HS2 or any other major infrastructure project will happily let their contractors, which clearly have no regard for local residents and businesses, run rampant without so much as a slap on the wrist. This, Mr. Deputy Speaker, simply must change. The presumption must change to be flipped away from what is convenient for the contractor and instead put in the interests of local people. Our roads have suffered under this project's weight. Across the network, we're seeing key routes falling into seemingly terminal decline. Key routes which have been taken over by HGVs going to and from compounds. Whether it's HS2 or East West Rail, or frankly any other project making use of the local road network, expectations have not even remotely met reality. This is a prime example of the failure to account for the cumulative impact of major, multiple infrastructure projects. Another is the enormous burden that these projects place on our local authority, Buckinghamshire Council. Bucks Council has valiantly stepped up to the plate and pushed back against these mega projects when they're on their plans, whether it be road closures or safety concerns over bridges or unwarranted and at times illegal hedgerow or tree removal. When these things harm the interests of residents and businesses across my constituency and indeed across the whole country. Time and time again, critical information has been withheld from Buckinghamshire Council by both HS2 and East West Rail, relating to road closures, traffic management, and a whole host of other key aspects of construction. All too often, the projects don't even talk to each other, let alone the council. And this is all to the cost of our council taxpayers. Fundamentally, they should not be put in this position in the first place. The council has been forced to direct more and more resources to deal with something in the form of HS2 that it didn't want in the first place. And certainly with East West Rail, however much benefit there may be from that particular railway and a new station at Winslow, whenever they happen to be delivered, it simply cannot be worth the detrimental state that the contractors have left our entire area in the process. Even to this day, HS2 and East West Rail claim they are good neighbours. Yet just this morning, I learned from the residents in Comerford Way, McLernon Way, that the track lane train is now due to arrive between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. right at the back of their houses. The disruption from that will be immense. The fact is that no one should have to put up with all of the issues from these projects, from cracked foundations in their homes, flooded fields where their crops once grew, roads that have become impassable with potholes, intimidating behaviour from the project security teams. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I could go on. But these problems cannot go on. They must be tackled head on. All major infrastructure projects based in rural areas must recognise their impact on local communities and take their responsibilities seriously. The Department for Transport must recognise this glaring flaw. I have countless businesses in my constituency demanding compensation for unreasonable and unfair treatment from all levels of this project, from contractors to senior management. No one has been willing to step up and take responsibility for the human impact that this ever-worsening situation is causing. Indeed, HS2 and East West Rail, they're both operating in isolation from reality. The reality of people's lives and livelihoods. The reality of public safety. The reality of businesses going under. The reality of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money it's consuming. This cannot be allowed to continue. And as we see in the news today, talk of delays, talk of ways to try and claw back some of that money, I urge the Minister, when he responds, to give a cast-iron guarantee at that dispatch box later on that as those cuts and those delays are looked at, not one cut, not one delay will impact on my constituents or anyone affected by the construction of this project, not least in the mitigations that have been promised, such as the bund at Twyford. This project, HS2 and East West Rail and all other infrastructure projects must be held better to account, and they must decide to change their behaviour in favour of local people and away from their own convenience.
Hear, hear.